Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of our podcast miniseries about the 43 group of Jewish ex-servicemen and women who took their fight against fascism from the battlefields of World War II back to the streets of London and cities around Britain. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, we recommend going back and listening to that first.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao. Bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
Where we left off last time, after a successful street fight against a group of fascist speakers, 43 people met in London, mostly Jewish and mostly ex-servicemen and women, and they set up a formal organisation to fight the re-emerging fascist movement by any means necessary. Daniel Sonabend, author of We Fight Fascists, the 43 group and their forgotten battle for post-war Britain, explains more about the group and their strategy.
The 43 group's aims and objectives, as given in one of their early pamphlets, were as follows. 1. To advocate the immediate passing of legislation to make fascist and anti-Semitic organisations illegal. 2. To combat actively all fascist and anti-Semitic organisations by A. opposing their activities and B. publicly exposing them. 3. To awaken and unite all sections of the public against the menace of fascism. 4. To develop an organisation capable of communal defence. And 5. To work and cooperate with all the other bodies combating fascism and anti-Semitism. Basically, for the 43 group, the idea was defeat the fascists at all costs, no matter the method. The most important thing was to knock the fascists off the streets. If possible, to get the government to ban them outright, although that was never going to happen, but certainly to smash the fascists off the streets and get them to crawl back into the holes they came from. And to let it be known, and this was why it was very important for the 43 group to identify as Jewish, that the Jewish community was not going to take anti-Semitic provocation lying down. These were Jewish men and some women who had fought for their country. They had grown up in tough environments. They dealt with anti-Semitism from the moment they entered the school gates. They had dealt with Mosley's East End campaign. These were tough Jews. These were not Jews that were going to lay down and take the beating anymore. They were revolting against the stereotype of the weak Jewish tailor and moneylender. These were boxers and wrestlers and martial artists. These were fighters. These were people who were a new generation of what it was to be Jewish, and these were not easy targets. And they were determined to show that. However, in very much leaning into the Jewish identity of the 43 group, the organisation realised that although it needed to identify as Jewish, it could not be exclusive in any way. Membership was open to all. Whether you're a man or woman, no matter what your religion, all were welcome, no matter what your race, your creed, all were welcome, and no matter what your politics, all were welcome. So long as you're against fascism, you're welcome, which meant that the 43 group contained within it conservatives, liberals, socialists, and communists. It contained Zionists and anti-Zionists, and it was welcome to all. So long as you were aware and appalled by the existence of fascism and believed it needed to be defeated, you're welcome within the 43 group. Because it was a Jewish organisation with a membership with very diverging politics, one of its chairmen, a man called Geoffrey Bernard, imposed a rule which basically declared that nobody was allowed to discuss politics. Because if you have a bunch of Jews arguing about politics, you're not going to have a functioning organisation. So the 43 group said, no political discussion is allowed, everybody's welcome, please don't argue about politics, we're all on the same side, we're all against fascism. Similarly, the group was very willing and open to work with any organisation that was opposed to fascism, which meant it had an informal alliance with the communists and the Communist Party and other sort of communist organisations working in Britain. And because, especially in the summer of 1947, the communists were very much fighting against fascism, the 43 group very much saw them as allies. However, the 43 group was also constantly being identified as communists themselves, by the police and by the press, and this was something they were to dispute and to make clear that they were not communists. And they frequently stated in their sort of publications, we are not affiliated with any political organisation, we do not take money from any political organisation. We are our own beast. We are anti-fascist, and anti-fascism is for everybody. It does not matter who you are or what you believe in.
This new attitude of militancy appealed to lots of young Jewish people, like hairdresser's apprentice Vidal Sassoon and his friend Jules Konopinski, who was at that time a teenage refugee from the Holocaust, living and working in London's working-class East End, which was a key area which was targeted by fascist organising.
I, for one, thought it's about time, because having been as a child living in Germany, and then even in Poland, which wasn't was also anti-Semitic, I learned the idea, and I felt the idea was this time, I'm not going to turn my back. I'm not going to not meet people in the eyesight. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to back down. When confronted, I stand up. Or, more important, when it looked like I might be confronted, I'll step in first. Because if I get in first, I may get a good hiding. But at least I've done the right thing of giving somebody else a good hiding as well. And then other people, I suppose, had the same idea. And they decided that if we can't get the authorities to do it legally, if the police won't act, if our Jewish organizations that we depend upon won't give the okay for us to do anything, then we'll have to become a vigilante. In the sense, it was never known as vigilante. It wasn't set up for that reason. It was started off to counter their verbalism, their public meetings, and to counter their book clubs, and to counter their documentary distribution. And that's how it started. But then, it quickly snowballs, just like everything else. And then we ended up as an organization of people of all ages, of all religions, of all religious creeds, of all colours. And we decided that the time has come to take the battle to the enemy. Don't wait to be attacked.
Here, Dan explained some of the basic ways the group operated.
The 43 Group was primarily a street-based organisation. The majority of its activity included turning out at fascist street meetings all around London, and at first at least, heckling and barracking and making sure that the speaker could not get their message across. In the summer of 1947, the group came to realise that this was not necessarily the most effective approach, and really leaning into the physical violence that they had been exploring, thinking about from the outset was very much needed. And so on the 1st of June 1947, the 43 Group attacked two meetings on the Sunday night, one in Tottenham and one at Ridley Road in Dalston. And these two attacks began a summer of quite considerable violent clashes between the 43 Group and Ham's British League in East London, and to a slightly lesser extent Burgess's Union of British Freedom in West London. One of the 43 Group's most effective tactics was what was called the flying wedge, where some of its larger members come together in like an arrowhead rugby scrum, and they'd sort of charge through the crowd and pass easily through the crowd, smash through any cordons of stewards or policemen and smash the speaker off their platform. In those days, the police were obliged under the Public Order Act to close any meetings if a disturbance of the peace was caused, and a very clear disturbance of the peace was the fascists being smashed off their platform. So this was seen as the most effective way of ending a fascist meeting as quickly as possible. It wasn't the group's only approach. They never had a one-size-fits-all approach, and they were always experimenting with different tactics. Sometimes they'd start fights in the crowd with fascists. Sometimes they start fights in the crowd with each other to just start to cause a disruption. Sometimes they would let off fireworks or flares or other things to sort of cause chaos in the crowds. At first, fascist crowds didn't really exceed more than a few hundred in some of its most popular spots. But around Ridley Road in Dalston in East London, in August and September 1947, crowds began to get into the thousands, peaking maybe around 10,000. This was originally kicked off when an anti-fascist journalist called Frederick Mullally challenged Ham in the pages of the Sunday Pictorial, which was the forerunner to the Sunday Mirror. And he basically said, I'm coming down to Ridley Road, Ham, to take your platform. You dish it out, let's see if you can take it. And as a result of that column, thousands of people came down to sort of watch what would ensue, and that kicked off 10 weeks of violence in which many different organisations were present, including on the fascist side there was the League, but on the anti-fascist side there were various trade unions, communist organisations, the National Council for Civil Liberties, and of course the 43 group, who were far and away the most violent of the anti-fascist protesters. And for 10 Sundays in a row there were these huge clashes which turned into sort of basically riots every Sunday at Ridley Road in Dalston. This was the epicentre of the conflict, but fights were happening all over the city. The fights were primarily in London, but there were conflicts elsewhere. And on a given day, a group of sort of the 43 groups, most effective members might go to 3 or 4 fascist meetings in a day to sort of turn over their platforms and cause as much chaos as possible. But the 43 group was not just a street fighting organisation. It also had a newspaper called On Guard. On Guard was not, although it was published by the 43 group, it did not present itself as a 43 group paper. Instead, it presented itself and was very much an anti-fascist paper. It reported on fascist activities in the UK and around Europe and the world, but it also dealt with all issues to do with racism and prejudice, reporting on lynchings in America, apartheid in South Africa, and this very much exemplified the 43 group's philosophy that the fight against fascism was a fight against prejudice, and that was a fight for sort of all minorities and anyone who might be targeted. And they frequently had black writers writing about the struggle of black people in Britain, and sort of other sort of writers as well who sort of were writing about the struggles of their people. So it very much wasn't just talking about the Jewish struggle. It was, understanding that the struggle against fascism was a sort of a communal struggle. As well as On Guard, the 43 group had a very effective surveillance and intelligence section. They would send members to spy on fascists by sort of standing outside a fascist house or following a fascist car, or tailing a sort of a high-ranking fascist to find out what they were up to, who was meeting who, what was going on. But they also very successfully infiltrated either non-Jews or Jewish people who didn't look Jewish into fascist organisations, and were able to extract and either publish it On Guard or pass on to the government some very interesting and very sensitive information about what the fascists were up to, and were able to sort of publish and spoil many of the fascist plans because of the effectiveness of their spies and their sort of intelligence organisation.
The 43 group was careful and took various precautions before taking any action, which are all pretty much still relevant today.
It was done in a very clever way. You have to have information to act. You have to have people to act on the information you get. And you have to have the background people who can disseminate the information and also have the legal representation available. Nobody ever went out without somebody knowing where they were. Nobody ever went out without a lawyer being briefed in advance, or a doctor being available, that should that person need representation, even before you arrive at the police station under arrest, somebody is warned to go and see them. We've always taught, say nothing, don't say anything, just keep quiet, don't carry weapons. Who am I to talk? Don't do anything which would bring what we were doing into disrepute, because we weren't disreputable. We had maybe a few disreputable members, but all in all, we had a lineup of honourable, decent people who weren't in it. This is the important thing. We weren't in it for the honours. We weren't in it for the fame. We weren't in it for notoriety, believe you me, not for that. And we weren't in it forever. We weren't able to become MPs. We didn't want to become members of the Board of Deputies. All we wanted was to be able to lead a quiet life. And remember, all these people that worked on the 43 group and ran it didn't start their domestic life for maybe 3 to 4 years till the war ended. So work out, they went to the army in 1939, and the 43 disbanded in 51. So they had virtually 11 years of loss of domesticity. They didn't see their family while they were abroad in the army, and they certainly didn't have much time to see our families when we were in. Because unfortunately, when it first began, it was a full-time job, not a job. Job means entailing being paid. It was a full-time occupation, and we were available 24 hours a day to support each other.
Because police protected all of the fascist meetings, the 43 group had to contend with them as well and switch up their tactics.
The pattern from the very beginning was we realised that there's only one way to stop the speaker, was to get him off the platform. And in those days, the platform was a ladder or a wooden stand, and that was successful. Wasn't so hard to overturn those, and you had to organise a way of getting a wedge of people through, and sometimes even one person go forward, pick up the platform, and start the confrontation. But then it grew when the police became accustomed to our system, and they did these single arm link up, and then the only method to get through was to break the link. So there are two ways of doing this. Unfortunately, because of the way the police operated, the violence that we want to inflict, or vice versa, on us, had to go through the police. The police were always on the receiving end. So half the charges against us was of violence, threatening the police, assaulting the police. It wasn't meant to be that way, but it was the only way to get through. You know, you couldn't get through. You couldn't get through the door without breaking the door down. So you got charged with breaking the door. Then, of course, the police became cleverer, and they used double rows, and they linked the arms differently. They caused so that you couldn't get through. Today they got a clever idea. Today they use the kettling system, whereby they break up a crowd into a section. Thank God they didn't do it then, and just contain you in one corner. It was tried by them. It was tried by them in Dalston on a few occasions. They had as many as 4,000 police on duty, but they didn't quite get them all together. When they got them together, the whole thing was still moving. It was like a moving. But they tried to do the kettling. They tried to keep people in John Campbell Road, some in Sandringham Road, you know, stop them getting together. They knew that once they got together, a violence would break out. But the police were, in their own way, causing more trouble by the method they used. In order to get through the police, it was organised that if you form, like battle rank, going back to Roman days, you form a block of people who moved as a block that's inside the crowd. And whenever they needed to go through, they would attack from different angles so they could break through. And we trained this at Klein's of Bloom's gym in Earlham Street. One of the boxing managers of the day, promoters, that has used a gymnasium off Cambridge Circus, off Seven Dials, where we not only practice unarmed combat, but we practice means of getting through a crowd. When you went through, I always went through backwards, because if you go through forward, you put your face in danger. When you want to go through, a policeman goes through backwards. He's not quite sure which way you're going, and your excuse, if you're caught, is always, I was being pushed from the other side. So, you know, where was I, sir? I had my back to you. would I be wanted to go that way if I was facing that way? You know, we had to, you know, we had people there who had military training, and we also had support from non-Jewish people who were good anti-Nazis who fought the war hard, and at that time just didn't want to see. You know, I mean, Wingate was a man who supported us.
While the 43 group may have technically had rules against using weapons, this wasn't really workable all the time, especially as their opponents observed no such niceties.
Look, they carried weapons. They all had the belts. They had the leather belts with the SS, and they wrapped it around their hands, and they'd use them. They used koshes. They used weapons, and they used steel-tipped boots. They used knuckle dusters. Put it this way: if there was a big row and a battle ensued, and I mean a battle. I can remember one battle that lasted in Bulls Pond Road. It went on for quite a while, and it was unattended by the police. When Mr. Bean, May 48, it was battles. They lasted a long time, and people were physically hurt. Nobody got killed by luck. Had somebody got killed, I'm sure that if it'd been one of ours, the comeback would have been equally as heavy, and vice versa.
According to Vidal Sassoon, who later became a world-famous hairdresser, his weapon of choice was a pair of scissors, which he would have had a very good excuse for carrying. Jules told me that when 43 group members got arrested, they had a particular strategy for getting rid of their weapons upon arrival at the police station.
Now, what we used to do is when we used to come into the police station, and we used to signal to each other, 1, 2, 3, and then scatter, throw anything we've got. So there'd be a knife, a gun, you know, a knuckle duster, something flying around. They could never. I saw it, and they couldn't prove anything.
But despite the sometimes pretty extreme violence on both sides, there were some unwritten rules of the conflict, which have pretty much persisted to this day in the fight between fascists and anti-fascists in Britain.
But there was a code of ethics, even those days. They weren't out to kill us. I still say this. If they wanted to kill us, they could have gone out and caught simple Jewish people and just killed us. They could have caught me where I lived and killed me. I was never hiding. I was always know where I was, and I always lived in a quiet place where they could get me. I wasn't hiding. But we had a golden rule: you do not touch anybody on their own doorstep, and you do not touch their family. And when they one day did attack one of our members, we went to their heavy in Wilmot Street, where he lived. He was a porter at London Hospital. Porter, they carted the dead people around or whatever, porter. And he was a very heavy, violent man from even before the war. And they knocked on his door. I think it was Len Sherman and Johnny Wim and Jeff Byrne. I went inside and told him, you couldn't have done that. You should have taken a man and beaten him up on his doorstep. And in order to reinforce their threats, they emptied the coal from the fireplace of the coke, placed them upon it and said, don't do it again. And they never ever attacked us privately. So there was some sort of rule of war. Otherwise people would have got killed. Otherwise people would have got badly killed. Well, it didn't happen. They were there, I think, after the war. They were there to enhance their political belief. How they wanted to kill people, they could have done it privately, quietly. So thank God for that.
Of course, it wasn't just out of the goodness of their hearts that fascists weren't out murdering people. It would have been extremely costly for them, both in terms of public opinion, possible revenge attacks, and legal repercussions. Throughout the lifespan of the 43 group, its women members always played a vital role in the organisation. However, as Dan explains, the male leadership of the group, while progressive for that time, still had stereotypical and sexist views on women and what their role was.
The group had a decent number of female members. They were certainly in a minority, but it's probably a fairly sizable minority. The group saw the best way for female members to get involved was as secretaries. This was not seen as a put down in any way. The group had at its headquarters had a secretarial pool, which was very much seen as the nerve centre of the group, pivotal for mobilising the membership, for making sure that people were sort of where they needed to be, and for really being the sort of the nerve centre and the organisational hub of the group. And they saw that this was the best way for women to contribute towards the group's effective operation. Of course, many women did not necessarily agree that just being a secretary was all they could do, and there were plenty of secretaries, or a couple of the secretaries often went down to Ridley Road to get involved in the fighting, and there were a few female members who were sort of as notorious as fighters as the men were, and often five times as violent. Particularly infamous was a woman called Julie Slogan, who was once said to me that at first they thought they had to protect her from the fascists, then they realised they had to protect the fascists from her. As well as street fighting and in secretarial positions, women were often used for surveillance operations to keep watch on a house or a fascist. They'd normally send a male member and a female member to sort of spy together. Some of the group's most effective spies were women, and also the paper on guard was a great way for women to get involved, and some of its most vitriolic writers were women, in particular a woman called Judith Michaels. The 43 group seems to be existing in an interesting proto-feminist moment when it wants to make sure that women have great roles and great responsibility. And of course, many of these women had sort of served in the ATS or the Wrens or other sort of female auxiliaries during the army and wanted to obviously play a similar role in the 43 group. But there was still this assumption that the place for women was not on the battlefield because they probably just didn't want the women to get hurt. But as I said, many women disagree with that and often found themselves in the middle of the fighting, often fighting with fascist women.
At the time, homophobia in Britain was extremely widespread, and homosexuality was criminalised. Most famously, computer scientist Alan Turing, who played a key role in helping the Allies win the war, was chemically castrated in 1952 and driven to suicide after a conviction for having a same-sex relationship. So most LGBTQ people were very much in the closet. However, at least one member of the 43 group was openly gay.
One of the group's most interesting and effective members was a man called Harold Bidney. Harold Bidney was he was a warrant officer in Burma. He was a short little man, probably no more than like 5'3" or 5'4". And he was, at least amongst his friends, openly homosexual. He was the head of the East End section. The 43 group was divided into sections based upon areas, and the East End section was the most notoriously violent. It was full of these young, tough lads, many of whom had missed out on the fighting, and they were really wanted to sort of get their teeth into the fascists, and Harold Bidney sort of ran that section. He was also one of the 43 group's most effective intelligence operatives. I met another one of the heads of intelligence who said, I don't know how he did it, I don't know how he got information out of the fascists, but he just seemed to have a way of walking into a place and just coming out knowing things. They just talked to him for some reason. I mean, there is a sense that maybe because he was gay and had a very good sense of the... He was a lowlife. He was a spiv. He was a wheeler dealer. He famously sold nylons bought from American soldiers at the back of a pub. He probably just knew a lot of things about a lot of people and was very good at extracting information from them. And he turns up in the arrest record more than possibly anybody else. The fascists hated him so much. There's one time when a fascist Bidney heckles him in a meeting and goes, if there's anybody over here who could arrest that Jew Bidney. And there's another time when there was a fight on a train between the 43 group and the fascists. The fascists had no idea who was involved in the fight, so they just said Bidney was there and he was somewhere completely different. But any chance they tried to get him, they would. He sort of pops up everywhere, and I think he's just sort of wonderfully sort of mad character who is just also so sort of, I don't know if necessarily brave, but so sort of brazen in who he was, that being sort of quite openly homosexual in a time when nobody was made him a very sort of interesting character.
While Dan's not aware of any people of colour who were official members of the 43 group, black British people and others were involved in its newspaper, En Garde.
It did have writing for En Garde, a Dr. Joseph Mitchell, who was the head of the League of Coloured People, and En Garde covered when the African-American actress Hilda Sims was not allowed to stay in a London hotel. The 43 group covered that, and they also featured an article with Paul Robeson, the African-American singer and civil rights activist. I don't know whether there were sort of black members, but the group was very much interested in sort of the black struggle.
The class background of 43 group members was mixed, but the biggest section were working class people from London's East End.
The majority of the group, especially the large majority of its members, were coming from the East End of London, which was mostly Polish and Russian Jews. Also, these were mostly working class Jews and sort of quite socialist Jews. There was a strong socialist and communist contingent within the group, but also they had also had plenty of members from Central London and West London who would be more middle class, and they've had some fairly wealthy members as well. I think if there was a way to identify that these Jews identified themselves, it was as this generation of fighting Jews, identifying themselves very strongly with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, identifying themselves with the Haganah and the other sort of the Yeshuv and the Jews fighting in Palestine. And they would very much see themselves as a new generation of Jews who stand up and fight, a generation of Jews who knows what happens with the Holocaust, what happens when you don't fight, you don't just cower anymore. So I think that was the way they wanted to identify themselves as Jews, that this is the new type of Jew.
The Haganah Dan referenced then was another Jewish paramilitary group in Palestine, which the Irgun, which we mentioned last episode, split from, and which later formed the core of the Israeli military, known as the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF. Numerous members of the 43 group, including Jules and Vidal Sassoon, driven by anger that the British government was turning away boats full of Holocaust survivors, also travelled to Palestine in 1948 to fight. We talk more about that and the impact it had on the Palestinians who already lived there in our episodes 17 and 18. That's all we have time for today. Next episode is the final part of this miniseries, where we talk about some of the characters who were involved in the group. We also learn more about how the Jewish community reacted to it, the attitudes of the police, and we look at some of the legal cases which came up for the 43 group members. Finally, we assess the legacy of the group and look at lessons we can apply today. Our Patreon supporters can listen to that now. For everyone else, it will be out next week. Relevant levels of our patrons can also get 2 additional bonus episodes. In the bonus episode attached to part 1, we learn more about Jules' early life and his escape from Nazi-occupied Europe. In the bonus episode attached to part 3, we learn about the renewed fight against Oswald Mosley in the 1960s by people including Jules and other veterans of the 43 group. You too can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. Patrons get other benefits as well, like discounted books and merch. So for example, our patrons can get 10% off Daniel's book about the 43 group. Links to that in the show notes as well. If you can't spare the cash, that's completely fine. Please just give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your favourite podcast app and tell your friends about us. To everyone who supports us already, thank you so much for enabling us to spend time making this podcast. It really means a lot. Thanks also to Dischi del Sole for our theme tune. Links to buy and stream that in the show notes as well. Cheers and catch you next time.
Sotto l'ombra di un bel fior e le genti che partigiano. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao,